Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Happy New Year, happy 2024, happy year of the dragon. I hope you all had a magical Christmas and a very safe New Year's. I am very happy that we are in a new year. This is my first Herstory video of 2024 and I am very excited for this year. I just feel like it's going to be a good year. And before I move on, I'm going to have my upload dates on between Thursdays and Fridays. When it comes to Wednesdays, Women Wednesdays, which was kind of the whole point of this thing in the first place, it's really hard to also do my real job that I make money off of and also do this and make sure that it's done on Wednesdays. Give myself a little bit of breathing room because sometimes I really stress out trying to get this stuff up and going. So let's get into this. If you didn't know, January is Mental Wellness Month. So I thought the best way to ring in a new Herstory year is talk about the messed upness of women's mental health battles. A very rainbows and butterflies topic. Yay. With that in mind, let's begin this new year with the woman that not only was a pioneer in investigative journalism in the mental health world, but also broke a traveling around the world record set by a fictional character. I kid you not, that is a story. This is going to be a long one. Let's talk about Nellie Bly. Let's get started. The camera angle is off. I need to do something on this side. I need to figure it out. Anyway, born Elizabeth Jane Cochran on May 5th, 1864 in Cochran's Mills, which is part of present-day Burrell Township in Armstrong's County, Pennsylvania. Her father was Michael Cochran, who started out as a laborer and mill worker before buying the town's local mill and most of the surrounding land next to his family's farmhouse. Later in his life, he became a postmaster, merchant, then an associate justice at Cochran's Mill, named after him, in Pennsylvania. He was married twice. His first wife was named Catherine Murphy, and together they had 10 children. Then his second wife, don't know what happened to the first one, Mary Jane Kennedy, no relation, and together they had 5 more children. Elizabeth was the 13th daughter. Unfortunately, Michael died suddenly in 1870 at 60-ish when Elizabeth was 6. As a child, Elizabeth's nickname was Pink because she frequently wore the color pink. As a teenager, and really kind of like all teenagers, she wanted to portray herself as more sophisticated. So she dropped the nickname and changed her name to Cochran, because I'm guessing that her birth surname was Kennedy and it wasn't sophisticated enough for her, so she changed it to Cochran. That's what I think happened. Unable to maintain the land on their home, the family had to move. I don't know where to, but at this point, her mother, Mary, had remarried, but this guy was an abusive dirtbag. And thankfully, she ended the relationship by divorcing him in 1878. In 1879, when Elizabeth was 15, she enrolled in now Indiana University of Pennsylvania. It is here she changed her last name again by adding an E to her last name, making it Cochran. At this school, she wanted to become a teacher, but she was only there for 1 term, having to drop out to lack of money. She moved back in with her mother and 2 older brothers in Allegheny City, which is the modern-day north side of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Elizabeth tried to find work to help her family's financial troubles, but found it nearly impossible compared to her older brothers, who, by the way, were less educated than her. She got her start in journalism when she read an 1885 column in the Pittsburgh Dispatch titled, "What Girls Are Good For." Because women need to be told what we're good for. I mean, how else would we know? Thank you, opposite chromosome. Ugh. If you're curious, because of course I was, the column basically said the main argument for misogynists everywhere that girls are mainly for childbearing and keeping the house clean, and condemned women who pursued education, a career, and icing on the cake strayed too far from home. If a guy ever told me to say, please don't go too far from home, if I'm in the haunted wood, I won't go too far from home. I'll go too far from home if I want to go too far from home. This lovely specimen, and I am very upset I could not find the freaking face or name of the dude that wrote this article, had the gall to express, and he has daughters of himself. I want to make that abundantly clear before these words exit my mouth. His support of the practice of girl-child infanticide, which, if you didn't know, and I would have been perfectly fine never knowing this myself, is the thankfully now illegal crime of killing a child, mainly their own, within a year of birth. The fact that this had to be outlawed amazes me. At this point in time, it was a well-known practice in China of killing female babies, insisting that it saved women from a lifetime of drudgery. And the author of the article telling how women to do has daughters himself and supports essentially killing his own daughters. Anyway, Elizabeth, rightfully so, infuriated by this, sent an anonymous response letter to the editor George Madden. In this letter, she stated her thoughts of how women should have more opportunities available to them, especially those who are the main breadwinner for their families. She signed it under the alias, I kid you not, Lonely Orphan Girl. Don't ask me why, I don't know. How I wish I knew though. I'm assuming she signed it that way because her dad died but her mother's still alive, so she's not an orphan girl? I don't know. George was so impressed with this letter's combination of passion, rage, yet dignified writing that he put out an ad to find this lonely orphan girl. I'm sorry, because remember, it came anonymously. In the ad, he wanted to not only find the author, but asked the author to write a longer rebuttal piece, inviting the mysterious lonely orphan girl to the office. Elizabeth came forward, wrote, and published her first article for the Dispatch on January 25th, 1885, simply titled The Girl Puzzle. Brilliant title, might I add. It argued that not all women would marry and that there needed to be better jobs for women. This time, however, she signed it under her official pen name, Nellie Bly, which was a misspelling of the song Nellie Bly by Stephen Foster. Her second article, Mad Marriages, was about how divorce affected women and argued for reform to divorce laws. These first two articles, but especially this one, focused on very touchy topics that were especially touchy in the 1880s, and Elizabeth refused to write about the normal womanly topics like fashion, theater, and gardening. But her article about divorce really got her into hot water. Now, I had to do a little bit more research on this. I already knew divorce laws have come a long way since the 1800s, but I had to know how controversial this topic was because she was getting not only criticism, which is normal, but threats, like really bad level threats, which is not normal. Okay, now, divorce has been a weird thing for centuries. But to understand divorce laws in 18th century America, we first have to look at British laws. Because of course we have to. America copied and pasted a lot of things from the British back then. There were 3 legal ways to divorce in the 18th century Anglo-American legal system. 1, absolute, meaning done, zilch, Bridgebird, forget you, go away. But both parties had the right to remarry, which is kind of weird to me. Didn't know you could be banned from marrying. 2, bed and board, aka divorce e mense e doro, aka legal separation. And 3, divorce e vinculo matrimony, aka annulled, aka invalid. Of these 3, only annulment was accepted under Catholicism. In 1700, the Duke of Norfolk, Henry Howard, officially divorced his wife, Mary Mordaunt, in 1700 after they had separated in 1685 because she had an affair with Sir John Germain. He made a previous attempt at divorce in 1692, but it was thrown out. Parliament then decided that divorce could fall within its own power and created a system of legislative divorce. This was an expansive and stupid restrictive procedure that allowed for absolute divorce in case of adultery, and only the husband could petition for it. Whereas if the petitioner was the wife wanting a divorce from the husband, it had to be adultery along with cruelty or bigamy. Because of course, women have to do more steps. Many of the colonies in America took their divorce laws directly from the British, but funny enough, these laws stayed in effect until 1850 because there were so many people wanting legislative divorces that the Virginia legislature was so overwhelmed that they didn't have time for normal government things. The new system was built gradually, and eventually all divorces were under the court control, no longer the legislative control. But until the women's rights movement at the time of Elizabeth's article about divorce fairness, it was still a common thing that women were still the property of their husbands, and the belief that a good man/husband would never abuse his wife due to the power he had over her, because back then women had to marry just to basically survive, would never happen. And as we know, that is a very dangerous mindset and was more about the husband's emotions rather than the protection and safety of the wife. And Elizabeth, in my mind, had every right to talk about this topic because she had seen the abuse and effect of both sides firsthand. So when Elizabeth wrote this article, there was a ripple effect and a half. And she made this ripple effect at just the age of 21. The feedback from her article, which mainly came from factory owners who threatened to pull their advertisements from the newspaper, she was, shall we say, forcibly reassigned to the women's pages, which was sometimes called the Pink Ghetto. Needless to say, she didn't like it and traveled to Mexico with her mother to be a foreign correspondent for the Dispatch to report about the corruption and poverty under dictator Porfirio Diaz's regime. She spent about 6 to 7 months reporting on the lives and customs of the Mexican people, and her dispatches were later published in a book called 6 Months in Mexico in 1888, where she accused Diaz of being a tyrannical czar, suppressing the Mexican people and controlling the press. When the Mexican authorities learned of Elizabeth's reports, they threatened to arrest her, and smartly, she fled the country, got safely back home, returned to the Dispatch, and found herself bored again. So she decided to quit in 1886 in the most slay way I can think of, by leaving a note on George's desk saying, quote, "I'm off for New York, look out for me, Bly." End quote. Elizabeth moved to New York City that same year, and at first finding a job was very hard for her. Being a female reporter in New York City, she was rejected over and over by male editors, and she was penniless for a good 4 months. This was till, I'm assuming, she got fed up, and in 1887, she basically stormed into the offices of the then, at the time, leading newspaper in the country, the New York World newspaper, whose owner at this time was some guy named Joseph Pulitzer. Don't know if you've heard of him. There's differing ways of how exactly Elizabeth got a job with the newspaper. Either she demanded to write a story on the immigrant experience in the United States, and Joseph said no and gave her a more challenging assignment, or Joseph gave her her first undercover assignment that was very challenging. Either way, this challenging assignment was Joseph wanted Elizabeth to investigate one of New York's most notorious insane asylums, the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island, now modern-day Roosevelt Island, where there were reports of brutality and neglect. Not only did Elizabeth accept this assignment, she would even fake insanity or mental illness and get the exposure firsthand of how these patients were treated. To reassure Elizabeth she wouldn't get stuck there, Joseph and the newspaper's managing editor at the time, Colonel John A. Cochrane, Grill promised to release her. This kind of journalism was sometimes called stunt journalism, but I think it's more like going undercover to expose corrupt government mental illness journalism. Before we go into her truly insane idea to admit herself into an insane asylum, we need to discuss asylums. And this is gonna be fun. When you think of asylum, the first thing that might pop into your head is the Weston State Hospital, or better known as the infamous Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Famous for its electric shock therapy, lobotomies, ghosts, demons. In its heyday, it was on 666 acres. There's maybe a portal to the underworld, stuff like that. Or maybe you think of Davern State Hospital, or the Davern's Lunatic Asylum, best known for being the inspiration for Gotham City's Arkham Asylum in Batman. The Women's Lunatic Asylum, which opened in 1841, was part of its imprisonment type island. It had not only asylums, but prisons, workhouses, general hospitals, hospitals for the incurable people, and almhouses, basically homes built by charities for poor people to live in, and for a time, a smallpox hospital. New Yorkers even nicknamed the island Welfare Island. Now, you need to understand that people were put into these asylums for, in today's standards, truly ridiculous reasons. Now, maybe you needed to be there because you truly were schizophrenic or a danger to yourself and others, having hysteria, war PTSD, all those things, to simply being depressed, bipolar, or gay, to, and I swear to you, these are true, laziness, masturbation for 30 years, yes, it's that specific, suppressed masturbation, degraded masturbation, tobacco and masturbation, syphilis and masturbation. Basically, anytime you touch yourself, you're going to the insane asylum. Your parents were cousins, you got scarlet fever, too, and these are even dumber, heart study, sniff eating for 2 years, basically you're snorting tobacco, and the two most ridiculous reasons that I could find to be put into an insane asylum I've ever heard of: novel reading, so book nerds beware, and bad company. Now, I don't know if you're the bad company or you had bad company. Regardless, you're going to the insane asylum. I found this list of everything else. I don't even know if half of these are true, but even if half of these are true, people were put into the insane asylum for reading too hard. Book nerds today, we're all going into the insane asylum. And on the studying too hard part, it was basically you studied religion too hard. When it comes to women, because of course, women wanting to be independent was madness. Taking the case of Elizabeth Packard. She was put into the Jacksonville Insane Asylum in Illinois in June of 1860. She was a mother of 6 and a housewife. So why was she put into the asylum? She stood up to her domineering husband. She got out after 3 years after the doctors deemed her incurable. Her story has so much more, but that alone shows women were put into asylums for talking back to their husbands. Using the alias Nellie Brown, she checked herself into a boarding house called Temporary Homes for Females and stayed up all night to give herself the deranged, wide-eyed look of a disturbed woman. Apparently this worked. She refused to go to bed and began making accusations that the other boarders were insane, scared the residents so badly, and duped matron Mrs. Irene Stennard so well that the police were called. After being examined by a doctor, Judge Duffy of the Essex Market Police Court, and for some reason, policeman T.B. Bockert, I think that's how you pronounce his name, at Bellevue Hospital for a day, she was sent by boat to Blackwell's Island. She stayed in this asylum for 10 days. During her stay, Elizabeth witnessed firsthand the horrifying conditions of abuse and neglect of some 1,600 other female patients. Mind you, the facility was meant to hold just 1,000 patients, and those 1,600 patients had just 16 doctors that were responsible for all those patients. Some that were there were truly mentally ill and needed more professional care. Others that were there were simply dropped off by their family members that were completely sane, or some were suffering from physical ailments. Elizabeth and the other patients were given little to no food, saying the bread was, quote, black and dirty, hard, and in places nothing more than dried dough, end quote. And she even says she found a spider in one of her pieces of bread. The asylum was cold. The baths were ice cold. Elizabeth noted that the bath water wasn't even changed between patients. One towel was used to dry everyone off, and they were allowed to bathe just once a week, and it was at that time they were able to use soap. Quote, my teeth chattered and my limbs were goose-fleshed and blue with cold. Suddenly I got one after the other, 3 buckets of water over my head. Ice cold water too. Into my eyes, my ears, my nose, and my mouth. I think I experienced some of the sensations of a drowning person as they dragged me, gasping and shivering and quaking from the tub. For once I did look insane. End quote. She said in her article about the odd treatment of how they were forced to sit still on benches for several hours a day. Quote, I was never so tired as I grew sitting on those benches. Several of the patients would sit on one foot or sideways to make a change, but they were always reproved and told to sit up straight. If they talked, they were scolded and told to shut up. If they wanted to walk around in order to take the stiffness out of them, they were told to sit down and be still. What accepting torture would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? I would like the expert physicians who are condemning me for my action to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up, and make her sit from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. on straight back benches, do not allow her to talk or move during these hours, give her no reading, and let her know nothing of the world or its doings. Give her the bad food and harsh treatment and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck. End quote. When the nurses weren't taunting or brutally abusing the inmates, there were several stories of where a woman was choked, given a black eye, or even hair pulled out of her head for no reason by the nurses. Quote, people in the world can never imagine the length of days to those in asylums. They seemed never ending, and we welcomed any event that might give us something to think about as well as talk of. There is nothing to read, and the only bit of talk that never wears out is conjuring up delicate food that they will get as soon as they get out. Anxiously, the hour was watched for when the boat arrived to see if there were any new unfortunates to be added to our ranks. End quote. When she was released in October of 1887, it didn't take her long to write and publish her findings. On October 10th, 1887, Elizabeth's first of a 2-part illustrated expose titled Behind Asylum Bars was published. To put it simply, this spread like wildfire and put Elizabeth in the investigative journalism Herstory books and became one of New York's most extraordinary sensations at the time. The next installment of the interesting story was published on October 16th, 1887, titled Inside the Madhouse. Her reporting put Elizabeth on the world's newspaper's permanent staff, and she later published the series into a 9-chapter book called 10 Days in a Madhouse in that same year of 1887. Her fearless investigation brought major changes to the inpatient treatment of asylums, and her work changed the journalism field forever. Elizabeth was called before a grand jury as part of an investigation into Blackwell's Island that started in part because of her reporting. The stories between the doctors and nurses were contradicting, and they blamed the poor conditions on a lack of funding. One of the leading doctors, Dr. Dent, said that he was unaware of the poor treatments and that not he, but other doctors were incompetent, and once again blamed the lack of proper funds to ensure the hiring of good medical professionals. New York, to help with these issues, allocated an additional $1 million a year to the asylum to care for it and the patients better. But 7 years later, the Women's Lunatic Asylum was shut down. Rightfully so. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that Elizabeth essentially beat a fictional character's world record. Well, now we get to that part of her already amazing story. And this part, awesome. On the heels of her massive success with the Asylum Exposé, in 1888, she suggested to the World's editor, John, that she should take a trip around the world. This idea came from the 1872 French novel Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. This book follows the fictional character Phileas Fogg, a wealthy English gentleman living in London. One day, he gets into a disagreement about a new section of railway opening in India. They claim it is now possible to travel the world in 80 days. He says, no shot, and accepts a wager of £20,000, which is half of his wealth, from members of a club he's a part of to complete this journey within this period of time. Journey ensues with a buddy of his. He marries a widow in India whose life they saved, and together they indeed travel around the world in 80 days. By the time Elizabeth read this book, it was very popular all over the world, and she wanted to try this out in real life. Could you travel around the world in 80 days? Apparently, Johnny Boy here barked, quote, "It is impossible for you to do it. You are a woman, would need a protector. And even if it were possible for you to travel alone, you would need to carry so much baggage that it would detain you in making rapid changes. No one but a man could do this," end quote. Elizabeth responded, quote, "Very well. Start the man and I'll start the same day from another newspaper and beat him," end quote. She basically said, I bet. Eventually, John agreed, and a year later, Elizabeth received news she was going to travel around the world, and her boat, the Augusta Victoria of the Hamburg America Line, would depart New Jersey bound for England at 9:40 a.m. on November 14th, 1889. She got that news on the chilling evening of November 12th, 1889. She had 2 days to pack and plan for 80 days, circumnavigating the globe in 80 days. She had 2 days to plan that all out. Well, she somehow figured it out and boarded her boat and began her 24,898-mile journey with nothing but a single bag that was 7 inches tall and 16 inches wide. She put her whole life into that thing. But women, we can't pack light. We just choose to not pack light lately. In that puny of a bag, she fit the bare essentials: underwear, toiletries, writing material, tennis blazer, dressing gown, 2 caps, 3 veils, flask and cup, needle and thread, handkerchiefs, and a jar of cold cream to, quote, keep my face from chapping in the varied climates I should encounter, end quote. But no gun, saying, quote, I had such a strong belief in the world greeting me as I greeted it that I refused to arm myself, end quote. To make this small bag even better, one of the reasons mainly men didn't think a woman could do it was that women needed many suitcases for a journey like this. Mind you, they ain't wrong. They ain't wrong. They're not wrong. But women, we can choose to pack lightly. We can. We just choose to not do it. It's complicated because we're women. So when she was asked by reporters if she needed help with her luggage, she said, quote, my luggage is already on board, thank you. I brought it on myself, end quote. And I can only imagine she got a little kick out of saying that. Elizabeth was unaware, but her journey caught the attention of other newspapers and journalists, such as John Brisbane Walker, owner of Cosmopolitan magazine. At the time, Cosmo, as we know it today, was a fairly new magazine, and John was hoping that if he could take advantage of this story, it might make the magazine famous. Shortly after Elizabeth left, he messaged a young, promising female editor of his own, Elizabeth Elizabeth Bisland and told the 28-year-old that she too was going to travel around the world. After basically arguing with her, which I don't know why she needed to be convinced to travel around the world, and somebody's gonna be paying you for it, please pay me to travel around the world. Please do. John finally convinced this Elizabeth, which I'm going to just call her Liz because it's gonna get confusing, to go on this trip. She quickly packed, planned, and left the same day, November 14th. John decided Liz might have a better chance at beating Elizabeth if she went west instead of east. Liz left by 6 p.m. that day, heading for Chicago. For the next few weeks, all the American newspapers could talk about was this now race to see who could make it back to New York first. Elizabeth, Nellie Bly, or Elizabeth Bisland. Which I'm just saying, Elizabeth Bisland has no business being in this. The world kept up with Elizabeth travels and made a Nellie Bly guessing match where readers guessed up to the second of Elizabeth's estimated return time, with the grand prize being a trip to Europe. They even made a freaking game board out of this. Like, look at this thing. I don't know how this works, but that's a cool thing. This was her map. She went from New York to Amiens, France, where she met the author of Around the World in 80 Days, Jules Verne. From there, she went through the Adriatic Sea to Brindisi, Italy, to Suez, Egypt, to Aden, Yemen, to Colombo, Sri Lanka, to Penang, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Yokohama, Japan, San Francisco, and back to New York. She traveled using steamboats and railways and detailed her adventures and interactions with the locals in each location and would send them back to the world to publish updates. Elizabeth lost 15 days and 17 hours through her trip due to delays, particularly in the Asian leg of the trip, but spent 56 days, 12 hours, and 41 minutes strictly on travel. Now, she did find time to enjoy herself during the delays in Asia. Notably, she visited a leper colony in China. This is an isolated community that quarantines and treats people suffering from leprosy. And like all tourists, you need to buy a souvenir. So she bought a monkey in Singapore. She named it McGinty, just so you know. The souvenir she bought herself wasn't a keychain or a stamp or a post-it card. She bought a monkey. And I'm going to say this right now, I don't know what happened to the monkey because this is the only part of the story where a monkey is mentioned. So I don't know what happened to McGinty. She did so many other things, but I can't cover them all. But if you want to know everything she did, I'll link an article below that details everything. I used a lot of that for the research of this part. Yeah, it's detailed. Detailed. By the new year of 1890, Elizabeth was approaching Japan on the RMS Oceanic. Yes, that RMS Oceanic. Quote, 1889 was ended and 1890 with its pleasures and pains began. End quote. If you're wondering, Liz is in Sri Lanka and doing pretty okay. Her route was basically backwards of Elizabeth's. They were basically head to head. However, Liz's luck ran out in England when a fast German steamer sent to take her from Southampton to New York was canceled, and she had to divert to Ireland on a much slower boat. Elizabeth, on the other hand, did the final stretch of her journey in style. Pulitzer had charted a private train to bring Elizabeth home in style, and this passenger train was called the Miss Nellie Bly Special. When she arrived in New Jersey to the awaiting crowd of 15,000 people on January 25th, 1890 at 3:51 p.m., she set the record for circumnavigating the globe in 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds, traveled nearly 25,000 miles. This was a new world record. She bested the fictional journey of Phileas Fogg by over 7 days. Liz returned 5 days later. Elizabeth would hold this title till A Man Just Had to Do Better, and a few months later, George Francis Train, very ironic name, completed the journey in 67 days. By the way, when Elizabeth did all of this, she was 26. After all this craziness and covering a few more influential journalism publications, Elizabeth retired from investigating reporting and got a lucrative job writing several novels for the New York Family Story paper, a weekly newspaper published by Norman Murnau. Between 1889 and 1895, Elizabeth wrote 11 novels, and most of these were thought to have been lost to history, till author David Blix announced their rediscovery in 2021. By 1895, Elizabeth met millionaire manufacturer Robert Seaman, either at a dinner party or on a train. When they got married on April 5th, 1895, Elizabeth was 31 and Robert was 73. Love has no age gaps. Robert is well known for making his fortune in the wholesale grocery business, and by 1869, he established the ironclad manufacturing company that made riveted boilers, tanks, the most durable enameled kitchenware made, I don't know what that means, and cans for shipping milk on trains. Now, Robert's loved ones weren't too jazzed about the age difference and thought, probably like we all are, that Elizabeth was marrying him for his money. One magazine, wondered if Elizabeth marrying Robert was an example of her stunt reporting by pretending to marry him, then write about it. Maybe she just really loved the dude, liked the guy. Maybe he wasn't a douchebag. There are reasons. After they married, they resided in his New York City home and traveled to Europe in 1896. Then in 1899, went back to New York to take care of some business problems. Up until his death, Robert continued to incorporate Elizabeth into his company. By the 1901 Pan American Exposition, Ironclad Factories was promoted by being, quote, owned exclusively by Nellie Bly, the only woman in the world personally managing industries of such a magnitude, end quote. On February 6, 1904, Robert was hit by a horse and wagon while crossing the street, and by March 11, 1904, he died of a heart disease brought on by the injuries. After his death, Elizabeth became the head of the Ironclad Company. In that same year, the company began manufacturing a 55-gallon oil drum, still widely used today in the United States. So now you know where this thing comes from. To make this chick even cooler, she became an inventor. She received a patent for an improved milk can and a patent for a stacking garbage can under the name Elizabeth Cochran Seaman. For a good while, she was one of the leading women industrialists in America, but due to her negligence and embezzlement by a factory manager, the company went bankrupt. After settling that, she went back to reporting and covered the women's suffrage procession of 1913 for the New York Evening Journal. This procession was the first suffragist parade in Washington, D.C., and the first large organized march on Washington for political reasons, meaning the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms in 1963 isn't the first. Mind you, this one had between 5,000 and 10,000 marches, and this had over 200,000. But still, girls did it first, and this makes it better than the Jobs March, I'm just saying. The march was led by activist Inez Milholland, who became known as the Iron-Jawed Angel on horseback, riding a white horse named Grey Dawn. Baller. This essentially Wonder Woman on horseback is coming. Elizabeth's article about the march was called "Suffragists Are Men's Superiors." In this, she accurately predicted that before 1920, women would be given the right to vote in America. And she was right on the nose about that. Which, it has been 104 years since women were given the right to vote. She also wrote stories about Europe's Eastern Front during World War I, became the first woman and one of the foreigners to go to the war zone between Siberia and Austria, and at some point she was arrested for being mistaken for a British spy. Because of course she freaking did. Elizabeth Cochran Seaman Nellie Bly died on January 27, 1922 of pneumonia at St. Mark's Hospital in New York City at the age of just 57. She is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Elizabeth's legacy is a mile long. In 1998, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. She was one of 4 journalists with a U.S. postage stamp in a Women in Journalism set in 2002. In 2019, the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation asked for artists to create a memorial on Roosevelt Island in honor of Elizabeth. The Girl Puzzle won and was opened in December of 2021. She was the subject of a Broadway musical called Nellie Bly in 1946, and in September of 2023, an opera based on 10 Days in a Madhouse premiered in Philadelphia. She's been portrayed in many films and TV shows. Most notably, Sarah Paulson's character, Lena Winters, in American Horror Story Asylum, is inspired by Elizabeth's experience in the asylum. And I need to say, I'm an American Horror Story fanatic, and Asylum is like my second favorite American Horror Story season. The one with Lady Gaga is my first one because it's Lady Gaga. And it was an amazing season, but it was Lady Gaga. And in 2 episodes of Drunk History. On May 5th, 2015, Google did a doodle of her. Until 1961, an express train part of the Pennsylvania Railroad was named Nellie Bly. In 2002, a large species of tarantula found in Ecuador is named Panthometipithecus Nellie Blyae. I don't even care if I pronounced it correctly or not. Yeah, that's a spider. I mean, it is cool that it's purple, but I don't like that it's purple. And it's hairy. And it's beady eyes that don't blink. Ugh. And lastly, Elizabeth leaves behind a trailblazing investigative journalism path for all women. I will leave you with these words of her passion and relentlessness pursuit of the truth. Quote, "I have never written a word that did not come from my heart. I never shall." There we go. First Herstory of 2024. Awesome possum. This story was a doozy to research coming back, and I'm happy that we discovered this chick. And I just love that she put herself into an asylum to get the full story of all that stuff going on. Like, who does that? Who does that? I love all of that. If you learned something today, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And while you're down there, please leave a friendly comment. And which story of hers is more badass? A sane asylum one or the travel around the world in 80 days? Let me know which one is more badass. I will be back next week with another story about women's mental health, and this one will be very, very fun. I'm researching it now, and this one's already getting my blood to boil. Anyway, it's gonna be fun. But until then, don't be well behaved. You just might make herstory. See you next time, guys.